Welcome to the overview of Chapter 5, Chapter 6 in the book as we look at interest groups, the idea of linkage institutions and political participation among them, linking you to your government. So thank you for joining me for this overview. We look at interest groups, a linkage institution, a very important one. We have looked so far at political parties and the roles that they play connecting people to their government, as well as campaigns and elections in the last chapter. And this chapter is going to focus on interest groups. And in the next chapter, we'll look at the media. So interest groups and the influences of policymaking. If you recall, what James Madison talked about, the author of the Constitution, talked about in Federalist 10 about factions, the importance of how do we control factions. Well, we can't eliminate them entirely, but we can control their actions. And we can do this by using pluralist theories of influence. The idea of separating the powers, as Montesquieu talked about, and the importance of making sure that we not just separate the powers in terms of branches of government, but also in terms of levels of government, so that all of government is checked, if you will, and balanced in terms of the separation of powers, the roles and responsibilities of each, and the check and balance of those powers. So we can do this, this controlling of factions, and interest groups really being the types of things he was envisioning, because interest groups are, by all means, factions that are trying to influence government to take particular policy agenda initiatives. And this is one way to try and address them, by looking at the powers of pluralism. The idea of no interest group, no one interest group can control all of the branches of government and all levels of government all at the same time. The idea here is you might be able to control the executive branch on the national level, but you wouldn't be able to control all levels of government and all branches of government all at the same time. And this is going to limit the powers of interest groups, the powers of factions in this regard, so that they are limited in terms of their power and thus controlling them, controlling the institutions through which they work. So very important in Federalist 10, as Madison talked about, this idea of competition and the power that they are competing for. This leads to our pluralist democracy we see today. The importance of interest groups vying for power and trying to get their agendas passed, or to keep the antithetical agendas from being able to pass, that would oppose them or go against them. And this is where interest groups work. This is essentially a lot of what they do. And this leads to the concerns about an elitist democracy. If interest groups basically are calling the shots, and therefore the American people in using their voices in democracy to be heard aren't, then we ultimately factions have won, and the elitist theory is alive and well. But the idea here of a pluralist democracy is to control their institutions through separating their power, through separating what power they can influence, and that has a significant impact here. Now, looking at interest groups, let's talk about what they are. Essentially, these are different types of groups, different types of collections of people, if you will, that have things in common. They either share a policy goal or they share common interests, something in which really brings them together in an area of commonality. So we see the ACLU very focused on civil liberties, the importance of protecting individual rights, and then the NRA, a single issue group really focused on the Second Amendment and the rights of individuals to have and carry guns. So these are interest groups. Think of them in terms of areas of common interest. This is really important in that respect. Now, what do they actually do? What do interest groups actually do? I came up with 5 things you need to know in relation to this, in terms of what they actually do. So we know they're areas of common interest, but what do they actually do? How do they actually carry this out? Well, one of the most important aspects for an elected official is information, and interest groups provide elected officials with information. I had a professor in college that always talked about the fact that as a staffer for a member of Congress, it was really nice to be able to reach out to interest groups and get feedback from them, get information from them on all sides, to then kind of gather and then allow you to look at the information and allow the leader, the elected official, to make decisions based on information coming in from both sides. Now, today we don't see as much of that because ideologically there are so many elected officials that are kind of dug in, but that still does happen. There still are people that tend to look at both sides of an issue or multiple sides of an issue, and the information here is really important. So interest groups providing that information to elected officials is a really valuable resource. If your information is bad or skewed or biased, that doesn't help the elected official, and it's probably going to lead them to not come back to you for further information. So the more you are giving them sound and pristine information that is reliable and truthful, the better off you are going to be in the eyes of that elected official for future reference and future meetings. So this is really important in terms of educating not just voters, but those in elective office. You want to have an information campaign that addresses these types of issues, and so that way you can communicate with them and keep that line of communication open. We see this on a number of ways. I mentioned the elected officials receiving information, but we've also seen here where ads and different commercials that have aired really are trying to impact and influence voters, but also sometimes these aren't necessarily just for voters. They're for elected officials and staff and other influencers of the elected officials that are there. So providing that information, even in the form of an ad that shows up on television or on the radio, or as a social media ad, are all ways to inform the public and inform the elected officials. Now, interest groups also help draft legislation. One of the best ways an interest group can get what they want is to propose legislation, come up with drafts, key language, ways that they would write the bill. And of course, it will probably undergo much revision, but it does help get your agenda out there in front of elected officials. They can change it, obviously, if they want to, and sometimes they do and sometimes they don't. But this is really important in terms of getting the information out there that you want elected officials to adopt as their own. Also, not just getting information to them in terms of legislation, but also testifying, serving as getting expert testimony before committees, different hearings that are held on this type of legislation or concerns around it is a great way to get interest groups out there, to establish credibility among those on the committee that are hearing you testify time and again, and that really solidifies the importance and the expertise of your status. And then if it gets on the news, or if there's cameras involved and you see more of that, all the better. It really tends to support your interest group. But these are some ways that they can use legislation in order to influence, and hearings is a really great way to do that. Congress holds hearings every day, all day, and having those discussions and having expert testimony from interest groups to be able to address the legislation in terms of what the bills would do, what the policy agenda is favored for, and how that could impact society in terms of if it were to become law. So this is important too. Remember, a lot of this legislation that we're talking about is probably going to impact a very small percentage of people, but in terms of the overall budget, we're all going to pay for it. So this is important when it comes to interest groups. They're really fighting for particular pieces of legislation that could likely impact the costs that we all pay, but who's going to benefit from it? It's usually a smaller percentage of people, which is why we see an interest group. And again, it varies based on the interest group. Obviously, an AARP type of legislation, the American Association of Retired Persons, is going to affect a lot more people that are retired or becoming retired. That's going to have a greater impact, but everybody's going to pay for that. Everybody's going to pay for those resources. So legislation is very important here as well. The third option in terms of what interest groups can do is to mobilize their base, their members. It is the most important aspect of really getting in front of voters. If you can mobilize your membership to call, write, go to town halls, to protest, to post on social media, to write letters, and to reach out to elected officials, this is a great way to get in front of them in numbers and really showcase the numbers of people that are really either supporting this or opposed to this. And it really shows that you're politically attentive. You're an attentive public, that you, to use that term again, that you know what's going on and you care and you really want to take action. Now, when I worked up on Capitol Hill, we didn't have social media, but one of the best ways for people to kind of reach out and show strength in numbers was to send postcards. And so we would get postcards, I mean, by the boxes of postcards, and tons of boxes of postcards. Now, I worked in press, but I would see this going to the mailroom, going to the mailboxes. I would see this in droves, these huge bins of postcards coming in on whatever issue was hot of the day. This is a really great way to mobilize membership. Now, a lot of times today we don't see as much of that. We see more emails and social media, and you can reach out by email and social media posts or action you can take via website that sends an email to your elected official or prints a letter that actually sends that information. But this is a great way to get in front of your elected officials to show your strength in numbers. And that is one way for them to see quite quickly, without a lot of disruption, that you that you are paying attention to these issues. Now, protests, are obviously just as important in terms of what we see today, and we've seen a lot of them as it relates to issues of social importance that are really important to people. And last summer, with the Black Lives Matter movement, a lot of protests taking place across the country. And this is a form of interest group participation, a form of an attentive public, paying attention to issues they want the Congress to take up, or they want state legislatures to take up. But we see a lot of, you don't just have to protest. As I said, there's a lot of other ways you can mobilize your members to do other things, such as post on social media with hashtags, or email from websites and that sort of thing. All of these can help mobilize the membership and show the elected officials that you're paying attention and what they do here in this space matters. They can also, interest groups can create PACs, and they do have them, much of them super PACs today, because of the amount of money that they can raise outside of a campaign. If they are independent of the campaign, they can raise unlimited amounts of dollars. And this really, with the Citizens United decision we talked about in the last chapter, this has really opened the door to super PACs by interest groups. With corporations and labor unions being able to raise and spend all kinds of money outside of campaigns, it really has allowed them to raise millions, if not tens of millions of dollars. And not just corporations and labor unions, but a lot of other interest groups that we see out there too, that really are interest groups for the most part, really will file as some type of a corporation, being more around an interest or around a single issue that really allows them, like a corporation, to raise unlimited amounts of money. So creating PACs in order to, or the super PACs in this case, in order to run commercials, mobilize voters. Again, outside of the campaign, you can't coordinate with the campaign, but it really can accelerate the voter mobilization and the voter information and really getting voices out there. And then the fifth and final way that we can see this is by endorsing candidates. When interest groups basically endorse and say, we support this candidate and you should too, it really goes a long way with voters, especially voters that may be on the fence but are supportive of an interest group, and then they see that this person is being supported and endorsed by an interest group, they're more likely to vote for that person, or more likely not to vote for that person, depending on the issue and how they fall on that issue. But endorsing candidates is a really important aspect of interest groups. They can exercise a lot of political power here with that endorsement, as well as keeping that endorsement from an elected official or a candidate running for office. So endorsement is really important here too. And then obviously, if you look at these 5 issues in terms of what's out there in creating PACs and endorsing candidates, mobilizing voters. This is the ultimate voter mobilization, right? Getting them out to the polls. Really that support among your members in order to get them to the polls to make sure they vote, and to make sure that the elected officials or candidates know that we are mobilizing voters. They will not shy away from that, because they will say, hey, we have some political power here, we're going to spend it, we're going to make sure you're noticing that we're getting voters to the polls for you. Don't forget our issues when you get to office, because otherwise you will be out of office as quickly as you were in. So that's an important point. Mobilizing voters, really critical here. At the end of the day, if you can't get your members of your interest group to go out and vote, they're really not worth the effort. So this is an important aspect of mobilizing those voters, is getting them to the polls. Now, I mentioned social movements, the right of protest. This is important, and we've seen this all across the country in recent years with social movements, and really trying to encourage people to become part of social movements and interest groups. These may be more informal interest groups. Lots of people are involved. They post hashtags, but maybe not necessarily joining an interest group. And maybe they are. Maybe some of them do end up joining. Many of them that are part of these interest groups or part of these social movements do join interest groups ultimately because they feel very strongly if they're going to take time out to protest, they will probably join an interest group and make their voices heard in that capacity. But we've seen the social movements really as a way for interest groups to really tout what they're about and what they want to do and how they can help. And that really does promote the interest group in terms of gaining additional members. And members can be a host of different things. Members can be people who join and pay a membership fee, or people who just sign up and are on an email list. That can be as simple of an interest group membership that we would see today. Now, public interest groups are these that we talk about that are really more broadly looking at issues like civil liberties or civil rights, focusing on education or the environment. We see AARP or the ACLU or the Sierra Club, very focused on environmental issues. All of these are public interest groups. They're really about protecting society from bad policy. And so those are broader interest groups. They're not necessarily one particular issue. A single issue group is the NRA. It is something that is focused specifically on a particular area of interest, a single issue, if you will, and protecting gun rights and the gun rights of gun owners is a really critical single issue group that has a lot of sway and lobbying power in Congress. They spend a lot of money in those capacities, and we'll talk a little bit more about lobbying here in a minute. But this is a public interest group. Now, as you can imagine, these vary large and wide in terms of how these interest groups are funded, and some of them being very well funded, others not so much. And some of them, like I said, you can join an interest group just by signing up for their email newsletter, and all of a sudden you are a member of an interest group. Or joining and paying a fee and getting a card like you see Betty White there on the AARP. So it really just depends in terms of the type of interest groups that are out there. And again, there's a lot of inequality in terms of the different resources and approach to these, and how much support they get from the public. Some interest groups will fizzle away as a lot of policies are adopted, and the group doesn't really have a platform to continue their efforts, or it loses traction with people, and so they're less interested in being able to stay a part of that group. So, or it morphs into something else, a different type of group or a different interest group that's out there. So we see that time and again in terms of how these morph and change. And part of that is because of what Madison talked about in pluralist theory, the idea that as groups become irrelevant and as they are checked by the pluralistic government that we have, the separate branches and the separate levels of government, they are being checked. They are being controlled through the institutions that we have today. And that really keeps them from gaining too much power. Some institutional groups that we see out there, we've seen intergovernmental groups like the National Governors Association, for instance. You have to be a governor in order to be a member, and usually all 50 governors of the states are members of the NGA. We see professional groups, labor unions and other professional associations like the American Medical Association or the American Bar Association. You have to be a lawyer to be a member of the American Bar Association. Corporations have their own interest groups. Things like the Chamber of Commerce or NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers. These are institutional groups. They are very focused on what their members care about, and they continue to take surveys of their members and polls throughout the year trying to gauge what issues their members care about in order to make sure that they are aligned with what their members want them to be doing. So that's really important here. We also see ideological groups. I mentioned environmental movements such as the Sierra Club. In this regard. We also see a number of consumer movements we've seen over time that have taken shape, as well as women's and civil rights movements and issues that are related to that. And we can see sometimes there'll be enough critical mass that there will be an interest group that is formed based on a movement or based on a protest that's happening. And sometimes it'll just be a broader movement and not really form into an interest group. And again, because of the pluralist theories of influence, we continue to see this type of this morphing of interest groups into social movements and into a more formal group, or sometimes not a more formal group, and we see that happening time and again. So what are some activities and things that interest groups do? This is important to note. Obviously, we talked about education, the importance of those in office and voters that are members or potential members. How can they really support this? Well, you can see here the different interest groups. A lot of them are business related or trade association related in terms of what is out there. So if you look at labor unions, for instance, or you look at the National Association of Manufacturers that I just mentioned, American Medical Association. These are, I guess I'd be more professional, but these are business or professional related. So you see a lot of kind of critical mass there about their members and trying to follow the priorities that their members care about. They're mobilizing their membership. They're creating PACs, getting out the vote, endorsing candidates. All of these things that we talked about in the 5 things you need to know about what an interest group actually does. The iron triangles we'll come back to in a moment, but developing relationships with elected officials is really important here. We use the term iron triangle or issue network to establish that relationship, in that it takes time to develop, and it withstands the tests of time. In that they don't just fly by night and then all of a sudden they're here and then they're gone again. They really are around for a long period of time, and that is critical in terms of interest groups, in really trying to develop relationships with elected officials and those who work for elected officials in order to get them to see the importance of the policies that they want to enact and take it on as their own, adopt legislation, and the interest group sharing with them their ideas for legislation. All of this is a part of what an interest group does on a daily basis. And they meet with staff members of elected officials all the time on Capitol Hill. I know I met with, when I worked in the press office, I met with interest groups and lobbyists, if you will. They weren't necessarily called that back then, but those that are looking to influence policy and the policy agenda. This is a lot of what we see interest groups doing, and that's really important in getting the policies and the priorities of their members up to Capitol Hill, so that it becomes part of law. One of the largest areas we see interest groups today is, as I mentioned, in business, and so we can really classify those as economic. We see business interest groups, trade associations, I mentioned labor unions, all of these, as well as professional associations like the American Bar, for lawyers, are really economic related. They're related to people and helping to create and keep jobs. So this is an important aspect of interest groups that are out there to promote economic opportunity and to promote job growth for their members. It is not lost on them that they are trying to make sure that members are able to keep their jobs and grow their jobs so that they have job security and that they have a job opportunity in terms of what we see there. We also see some of these interest groups are ideological in that they're either single issue or very focused on particular ideological bents of what they believe and what they support. We see the NRA, a good example of this, a single issue group, but very ideological in nature. The Club for Growth, very focused on opening markets and very laissez-faire approach to government's involvement in business. Also very ideological in nature. And then we see public interest groups, things like Common Cause, that is really focused on protecting consumers, protecting individuals, and trying to help create and keep jobs in those spaces, but also their civil liberties, their civil liberties and the importance of their freedoms that are out there. So those serving the public interest in that regard. We see some interest groups are focused on foreign policy. The Council on Foreign Relations is a great example of this. AIPAC is another one, focused on American-Israeli relations. And we see these are groups, again, that have foreign policy focus, but are really focused on maintaining that foreign policy, and governmental leaders and institutions are really critical to making that happen on the foreign policy front. And then we see public sector interest groups, those such as I mentioned the National Governors Association or the National League of Cities, that are really focused on helping their members, usually elected officials, leaders in their respective localities or in their states, to promote and help support them in their efforts when it comes to legislation, when it comes to policies and priorities, all of these things taking shape to help their members and supportive of their members on legislation when it comes to those in Capitol Hill or in Annapolis. We see the public sector groups, interest groups, particularly focused in those areas. In terms of size and resources, there's a number of them out there. We can see here that donations coming in the millions to these types of interest groups in terms of the money that they're raising. And you can see the money is flowing to Democrats and Republicans. It's flowing to outside groups. It's flowing to those that may have a particular ideological bent one way or another in these different groups. And the money is flowing in the tens or hundreds of millions of dollars to these groups, many of them having super PACs or some type of super PAC arrangement so that people can donate money in unlimited amounts. They are separate from the campaign, so that is perfectly legal, and that is where they get a lot of their efforts to do the things they do, to mobilize voters, to inform the public, to inform the elected officials, to mobilize their members, to engage in protest, and to get out the vote. All of these resources used for these political initiatives and the interest group building activities that we see going on here. Some can be very large, some may be very small, but again, they ebb and flow based on the priorities, based on what's important, and based on the money backing them up. They have more ability to do things such as the items I mentioned, the actions that an interest group takes, and the more money they have, the more they can do with those types of resources. Now, it's important to note that if there's not a lot of strong feelings or intensity among interest groups, it's going to be harder to gain traction. It's going to be harder to raise money. It's going to be harder to get voters to join the interest group or to take action, to write their elected official or send an email if you don't have a strong feeling about this issue. And so sometimes you need higher profile individuals that are members of your interest group to join this. We saw a public interest research group a PIRG, P-I-R-G. Ralph Nader was a great example of this. He fought for consumers for a long time. Seatbelts in cars save lives, which was really his mantra. And he was pivotal to using that public interest research group to get legislation on Capitol Hill that mandated that not just to have those in cars, but for car manufacturers to put them in cars. They are a standard issue today, and they have saved countless thousands of lives because of it. And it all started with an interest group, and Ralph Nader is credited with that effort there. But this shows the cohesiveness and the intensity that is important here. If you have an interest group that has an issue or issues that people care about, that they can rally around, that they can show support for, that they can support monetarily and through their time and efforts in writing and calling and posting social media posts, this is all important in terms of really getting your message out there, and that really can be very effective, as we saw in his case. Now, how do they exert influence? We talked about some of these ways that, in terms of what they do. Lobbying is very important here. They can use social media and mass media in terms of advertising, in terms of hashtags, in terms of getting people to websites to fill out information to email your member of Congress or your elected official. They also send out mass mailings. And most importantly, when these other things don't work, and we saw this with civil rights, when other things don't work, litigation is a resort that they will take in order to try and address the failings of these other actions. A great example of this was Thurgood Marshall, the attorney for the NAACP, that argued the case of Brown versus Board of Education back in 1954 before the Supreme Court. He said, we tried all these other methods of trying to get the NAACP to lobby, to publicize, to get voters informed. Nothing was having traction. People weren't really supportive, and so we took it to the courts. We used litigation, and that really was what made all the difference. And ultimately, a unanimous court decision by the Supreme Court to basically rule desegregation as constitutional as the law that is necessary here, and basically ruling separate but equal unconstitutional. So even the NAACP needed litigation because sometimes it wasn't enough to exert that influence through other methods. So they took it to the courts. And there were some other ways besides litigation, filing a lawsuit, that you can actually use this for the courts. An amicus brief, or an amicus curiae brief, known as a friend of the court brief, is essentially where an interest group weighs in on an issue. They basically are trying to put their thumb on the scale to influence this particular issue. And they do it by saying, hey, this is how we feel on this issue, and these are some of the reasons why. Here's the evidence for why we feel this way. So that's an amicus brief. They are not a party in the case. They are just an outsider, a friend of the court, if you will. But a lot of times, the justices on the court can find evidence in their amicus briefs that are very useful in making a majority opinion or a dissenting opinion. And so a lot of times we will find evidence from amicus briefs that actually comes up in a majority or dissenting opinion. And so this strengthens the focus of the interest group. They also have some really good kudos here. They can look at it and say, hey, we had an influence in this decision. We filed an amicus brief on behalf of the petitioner or the respondent, and this resulted in change. This resulted in judicial change from the court as a result of our actions. So that really is a feather in their cap in terms of showcasing, wow, we really know what we're doing, and here's even the courts that are saying we know what we're doing. So it really does kind of underscore their message. Now, some other actions that they can take, we obviously talked about protest and endorsements in terms of candidate support. A lot of times they can also advocate for people to donate directly to members' candidacies, really helping. And again, no coordination involved here with a super PAC, mind you, but a lot of times you can say, hey, if you support this individual, donate to their campaign, become a volunteer, help them out. And that's a great way to drive monies to political action committees, to candidates' campaigns, in really to get out the message and to show, hey, our members are supporting you. You should really pay more attention to our issues because our members are really supportive of what you're doing, and we're going to show that through these actions, and we're going to get you reelected. And that's that isn't lost on them. They really find that as critical and vital to getting reelected, and they will definitely not forget that when they're in office. That is something, because ultimately they will need to be reelected again, and they will call on that interest group for support and their members for that support. So that's really important here. All right, let's shift to lobbying now. Lobbying, essentially what an interest group does, we probably know it most often as grassroots lobbying, this idea of people going door to door and ringing doorbells and talking to people about issues and why they're so important, and then asking you to take action, to either join the group or write a letter or send an email or call. This is very grassroots in that you're doing it person by person, door to door, in terms of trying to get people to take action on it. And that is where a volunteer or a campaign worker for the interest group will, or a campaign worker for the candidate, if you will do the same thing in trying to get people to sign on, to get on board with this. And this is a really important aspect of lobbying. In order to get on the ballot, you've got to do grassroots lobbying. You've got to get people to sign petitions to get you on the ballot. And those have to be from registered voters that are registered voters. So really important, that grassroots lobbying aspect, to get out and talk to people, see how they feel about these issues. If you're not getting a lot of support from the grassroots, then you probably are an interest group that is dying, that isn't having a lot of support, and you're probably going to find it much harder in order to keep your interest group going. So grassroots lobbying, very important there. Then we get to the idea of actual lobbying. And this is where members of Congress are basically meeting with members of these interest groups that are lobbyists, are registered lobbyists today, and talking about the issues that they care about and how you can support these issues, or why you should support these issues. And this is an important aspect of legislating, of policy, because these individuals come to you with lots of information, lots of evidence about why they want you to support their issues, and they're really trying to get elected officials to sign on. Now, depending on the issue, that may or may not be an easy feat, but the idea here is that a lobbyist is the person who is doing that. They work for an interest group. In most cases, they work for interest groups. They actually will meet with members of that elected official's staff, sometimes with the elected official themselves, but a lot of times initially it's a lower level staffer that will take that meeting at first to try and see how that plays out, and to see if it's something we really want to sign on to. Then from there, they may take next steps for future meetings and that sort of thing. But that's kind of how the lobbyists will do their work, if you will. Lobby is a very informal term. The idea is you're waiting in the lobby for members of Congress to come by, and the idea is you're going to lobby them. You're going to try and convince them why you want them to support your issues and whatnot. That's really important for an interest group, because if you don't have lobbyists, you're not getting your message in front of voters. You're not getting your message in front of the people that you really want to adopt the policy. And without that, you're not going to bring about any real and lasting change. It's going to be a lot harder to get elected officials to do that if you're not taking meetings and making that happen. Now, there is a slide here about what lobbyists actually do that goes into more detail here that I would encourage you to check out. The link is in the slides, so do take a look at that. But the idea here is essentially that is what they're doing. They are trying to inform elected officials and get them to sign on to issues that they care about, and and to obviously take on those policy issues as their own to support the interest group in that capacity. Now, how do they do it? If they're an insider, they can use an iron triangle. So maybe they've got a contact on Capitol Hill or in that office that they can relate to. They have a friend who works there, and they can take them out to lunch and have a conversation about it. They can talk to them informally. They can set up a meeting and find ways to get that message out. So there is some of that in how the insiders can become more connected to those elected officials. Now, as an outsider, it's a lot harder. You obviously have to use more pressure, and this is why lobbyists are so important as insiders, because they really kind of cut out the middleman and really can get the meeting as an insider, and that carries a lot of weight for an interest group. They don't want to pay someone who's working from the outside. They want to pay somebody who's already on the inside and can make this happen quickly. Can you get a meeting with the congressman? Can you get a meeting with the senator? How quickly can you do that? That's an insider, right? An outsider is going to have to use a lot more public pressure. They're going to use the media. They're going to use social media and mass media, commercials and ads that are running. They're going to use email campaign or postcard campaign really to try and put the pressure on in order to get those meetings. It's a lot harder to do that from the outside than it is from the inside. It's a lot easier to set up those meetings and do them quickly. As an insider, you definitely have an inside edge in making that happen. What are they going to do when they do meet with them? They're going to provide them with information. The most important thing that an interest group can give to an elected official is information. Okay. The most important thing that an interest group can give to a candidate is money. Right? Is support, getting your members to donate cash, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later. But providing information here to a member of Congress is so important because of the fact that this information is going to be used in hearings, in policy, in legislation, and hopefully in what becomes law, in implementation with the bureaucracy carrying out those initiatives. So lobbying them and giving them information and correct and accurate information is really critical here. You burn a bridge through inaccurate information that becomes known as being false, they probably will never take a meeting with you again. You have burned that bridge and that relationship is over. Very hard to come back from something like that. So you definitely want your information to be accurate. You want it to be good evidence. You want it to be true evidence that has been tested and that is found to be accurate. If you don't have that, you're going to have a really tough time ever getting a meeting with that elected official again, or a member of their staff for that matter. Now, lobbyists also can contribute. They can give to parties. They can give to candidates. And they can also create their own super PACs, uncoordinated with a campaign, but there's lots of ways that lobbyists can contribute. Now, interest groups having their own super PACs is probably the best way to raise lots of money and to do it quickly and to use it in social media and other mass media methods. But we see a number of PACs today that are developed and used, much like another elected official would use it in order to dole money out in limited amounts to candidates. That is a way for a lobbyist to show support of a candidate. It is limited in terms of what they can give, but it is a way that they can show the candidate that they are in their corner, that they have their back. And so incumbents definitely benefit from this type of contribution, more so than candidates that are running from the outside. And so you see a lot of committee chairs and veteran members of legislatures getting a lot more of this PAC money than where you would see elsewhere. We're going to watch this particular video in class, but it is an amazing and very interesting in terms of how lobbyists can go too far. And the 60 Minutes clip with Leslie Stahl here talks with Jack Abramoff, a former lobbyist, one of the top lobbyists back in the 2000s in terms of his wheeling and dealing and how it eventually caught up with him, and what happened and what lessons he has for future lobbyists and future interest groups today. But it is an interesting take on the fact that lobbyists can take it too far and can really kind of bend the rules and basically think they're above the law, which they are not. And he spent time in prison proving that lobbyists are not above the law. and that ultimately, if you bend the rules and people catch you, you will go to jail. And so that's where lobbyists do have to be careful in abiding by the guidelines, the guidelines of elected officials. But I will tell you that those guidelines are also sometimes very fluid in terms of how they are being developed and enforced. So you have to be very careful there. But there are a couple of different aspects to that, and that's why this clip is a really great one in terms of lobbyists and lobbying today. The revolving door is very popular among interest groups and lobbyists because we see elected officials that when an administration comes in, they are a member of that administration, and then when that administration leaves and goes out, they join interest groups. They sign up as lobbyists. And we see this continuing revolving door in terms of going to work for the government and then coming back out. And a great example of this is people who worked for President Obama. That when President Trump was elected, they left office, they went to work for interest groups, and now with President Biden back in office, they're coming back into public service. This is a great example of the revolving door. When these individuals who were working for government leave and then they return and come back. And both parties do this. It's not just Democrats, it is Republicans too that do this, that have this revolving door. And there have been some limits placed on this revolving door by Congress through legislation. There is a moratorium on lobbying Congress when you leave. You cannot, for 2 years, I believe, you cannot lobby them directly, but you can go to work for an interest group, and this is where it's fluid, right? Because you can go to work for an interest group in which other people go to lobby, even though you're not a registered lobbyist, but you can give them advice and be paid for it, but not register as a lobbyist because you're not actually going there. But you can connect these other individuals that are working with you, and they can go and talk to those people. So it's very fluid. Again, there's lots of ways around the rules, but that's the revolving door. And as you can imagine, it does tend to stink a bit. It does smell in terms of how some of those rules are overlooked. And it's designed, I mean, the idea of those laws in place is designed to keep people from cashing in on their lobbying efforts and then going back to Congress to basically make lots of money by advocating issues. But what we see is exactly that. People that leave elective office go to work for interest groups, and where do they go? They go to Washington, they go to K Street, they go to places where they can cash in on that. And then use that in order to create a new career in lobbying, in working for interest groups to advocate to their former colleagues on Capitol Hill. And that's what we see time and again in terms. And again, both parties do it. We see this with government officials at all levels of government too. It's not just in Washington. We see this at the state level. We see this at the local level. There's a number of these revolving doors that are out there. Some top interest groups that are giving money to campaigns. We can see that this is in the tens of millions in terms of money that's out there. The money does flow and where they want the policy to go. And we see a significant number of resources here from the finance, insurance, and real estate, a lot of them hedging their bets. They give money to Trump campaign, they give money to Biden campaign, and they're doing this to basically hedge their bets. So whoever gets in office, hey, we donated to your campaign, and you got that time and again. So that continues to show the dominance of interest groups. Again, it is pluralist. I mean, go back to Madison. It is a pluralist theory in terms of what's available here, but the idea is interest groups still have a lot of cash, and they are exercising that cash in order to try and cash in and gain access to elected officials and the policy agenda. So we see this with some of the interest groups you see here. The Chamber of Commerce, Pharma, the pharmaceutical industry, the American Hospital Association, Blue Cross Blue Shield insurers, the American Medical Association, Business Roundtable, and even Amazon, Facebook. They're all up here. They have their own interest groups. They have their own PACs. They are raising money. They are lobbying Congress. They are lobbying elected officials on the state level. And so we see a lot of money in this space. Now, again, are we limiting those factions? We are, by controlling their institutions, by controlling the branches of government and the levels of government in terms of what we saw before, but interest groups definitely have sway. So it leads to the question, are lobbyists good or bad? Are interest groups good or bad? When they do provide information that is helpful to elected officials, they are a linkage institution in connecting people to their government and mobilizing voters. We saw that. But they are also very wealthy and powerful, and they have a significant overrepresentation in terms of when an elected official takes a meeting, who they meet with, and what they talk about. And that's where the concern is, are the national interests being sacrificed because interest groups are too cozy with elected officials, and elected officials are too cozy with interest groups. One of the great examples actually just happening is this American Families Plan that Bernie Sanders, that President Biden has touted, essentially a $1.9 trillion plan, and Bernie Sanders wanted it to include lowering the eligibility age to 60 years old for Social Security and Medicare benefits, not Social Security. And then a lot of the lobbyists from the insurers wanted to oppose that. And so we're at a back and forth right now. Who's taking the meetings with these officials in the White House and in Congress in terms of how that's going to play out? Right now it looks like President Biden is punting on that issue by not including that in his bill. And so Bernie Sanders says, well, we'll see about that. But it does beg the question, is President Biden, hearing from interest groups and lobbyists that are basically telling him that they don't want that's not really what they stand for, and they want to support here. So to be continued, we will see, but it really does beg the question of are lobbyists good or bad for the policy agenda, for the American people, and is something we will talk more about as we move forward. Iron triangles, I mentioned this a little earlier. What is it? Well, it's basically a relationship that, again, is iron because it stands the test of time. And it is a back and forth relationship between a member of Congress or a member of an elected official in Congress's staff, a staff member. A lot of times it's a staffer, a member of an interest group, so it could be a lobbyist, could be just a higher level person in the interest group, and then a member of the bureaucracy, somebody within a department or agency that can be impacted or help with implementation of whatever policies this interest group wants to carry out. And so this is a very common occurrence. We see thousands of these iron triangles taking shape among members of Congress and interest groups and the bureaucracy. So basically, what do they come together for? It's to craft legislation that either helps the interest group and its members, or helps the interest group by crafting legislation that opposes whatever legislation is out there. Trying to kill a bill, for instance, is a part of this iron triangle. This isn't a very casual relationship. These people have known each other for a very long time. They're trying to get that electoral support from members of Congress, the interest group is, and they're trying to get buy-in from the bureaucracy in terms of how to implement it. So all three of these individuals working together in order to change policy or get policy adopted and implemented, passed into law, and then implemented by the bureaucracy. You can understand the importance of the bureaucracy in that regard, because trying to get them on board with how to implement it, how to actually carry it out. Now, that's an iron triangle, and again, it's a relationship build. We've known each other a very long time, so it's like iron in that it's very strong and weathered and has been around a long time. We also have what's called an issue network. And an issue network is essentially something where lots of people that are members of iron triangles come together for a particular purpose. And healthcare, Obamacare was a great example of an issue network. Lots of people in interest groups and congressional committees, staffers, members of the bureaucracy, all coming together to work on these healthcare initiatives. And then when Obamacare is passed, then the bureaucracy takes it over in terms of implementing, and the issue network kind of disappears. But I would argue that the issue network is kind of a precursor to developing those iron triangles, because those people that have worked together on this initiative ultimately will develop stronger relationships. They're people, and people helping people, calling in a favor, working with each other, develop those iron triangles, which is what we see there. So ultimately, what does it become? Well, it becomes an issue network probably becomes a more formal iron triangle in smaller bits and pieces. Okay, so an iron triangle, much more formal. It's around for a long time. These people have known each other for decades. They are usually members of the Congress, as well as the interest group, as well as the bureaucracy, and they're working together. They've known each other a long time. Maybe they've worked together in the past. These are very formal relationships, and they can call on them at a moment's notice in order to talk about policy and legislation and what we can get passed. The less formal arrangement is the issue network. This is what's on the right, and this is really a shorter period of time, people working together. And again, like I said, this starts to fray when the issue gets passed, and there's no need for the issue network to be there anymore. But what does it morph into? It morphs into a lot of very formalized iron triangles, because you see who you can rely on in the issue network, and that's where you start to develop your relationships, which leads to the iron triangles that we have today. So you may remember this from Unit 2. In terms of why they're useful, the differences between the two, but that essentially breaks it down that way. So as we wrap up this chapter, what are an interest group's most valuable resources? Well, remember, to a candidate, the most valuable resource you can give is money, okay? You can help with voter mobilization, you can help with getting out the vote, you can help with endorsements, and helping them ultimately to win elections. Because if they don't win, then you have nobody to go to support your policy. So an interest group's most valuable resource to a candidate is cash, okay? To really support them through PACs. Super PACs, again, uncoordinated with the campaign, but you get the idea. To an elected official, however, the most important information you can give them is money. Is information. The most important resource you can give to them is information. So to an elected official, they don't need money. That's called bribery, okay? So that's illegal. But information is key, because now they're developing policy. They're developing, they're drafting legislation, and they need your information, your evidence, and the information that you have there. And so there's two types of information the lobbyists can actually give them. The first is substantive, and this is factual information, that evidence I was talking about, based in fact, that can be researched and can be used in legislation and in policy. That's really important here, and a valuable resource for a member of Congress to be able to use to craft their legislation. The other type of information is political information. This is things like political cues, polls, polling information, information on their voters, on how the voters feel about particular issues, and other types of information about what the landscape looks like in terms of the political races that are coming up. All of these have an influence on the candidate, if you will, and that elected official will eventually be a candidate once again. So the political information is an important piece of how to keep the member connected to the campaign, even when the campaign may not be going on right now. But there are some really great political cues there, looking at polls and data, other information that can really help them keep their pulse on what's happening in their district or in their state, depending on who's being discussed there. And that's the idea of political information. We saw the commercial from the American Lung Association. This is a great example of interest groups in action. Some of them are more pointed. This one was just kind of like, call your member of Congress. Some of them are more pointed. Call Senator Rubio and tell him that you don't want this, or call Senator Portman and tell him you don't want this, or something like that. But again, that's just one more way that interest groups can mobilize their members in order to showcase their political strength, and we see that time and again. Now, there are regulations around interest groups, as I mentioned, and we saw that clip from Jack Abramoff and on the 60 Minutes. The idea here is they do have First Amendment protections, they do have freedom of speech, but there are some aspects of what is a lobbyist. 1946 established this. What is a definition of a lobbyist? Someone who is who is approaching elected officials and talking to them about policy and legislation that could impact the people that they represent. Ethics in government essentially makes them disclose financial information in terms of what elected officials are receiving money from particular individuals, and this came out of the campaign finance laws. And really, this is kind of showing who are the people that worked for interest groups that are coming back, that are giving money to the campaign, that are coming back into office. Maybe I'm hiring them to work for us or something like that. And that information needs to be disclosed. It needs to be publicly available information so people can see it. And then the 1995 changes to lobbying disclosure actually came and required a lot more reporting of money that is not just money but also gifts. It limited the number of gifts. One of the funny parts about lobbying is you can't take a member or their staff to lunch, but you can stand up and buy them a sandwich and a coffee. So you can't take them to lunch, but you can do that if you're standing up at stand-up tables or whatever. So it's really quirky sometimes in that respect in terms of the law and how people get around the law. But there is regulation around it. And you have to be very careful about how you handle that. The Honest Leadership and Open Government Act in 2007 restricted this even further and said you can't take gifts over a certain amount of money from lobbyists. You have to disclose gifts that you do take under a certain amount. There is a waiting period, as I mentioned, before you can lobby elected officials. Once you leave office, and then you have to register as a lobbyist. You have to report how much money you're making, and the waiting period, as I mentioned. So there's a lot of regulation around lobbyists today to try and keep them honest. But there are a lot of ways that, again, some of this is very fluid in that they can use it to their advantage, and we see that time and again. One other concept that we want to address here as we close out the chapter is really this idea of free riders. These are people that don't join an interest group but really benefit from it. And clean air is a good example of this. When we hear people talking about clean air and supporting clean air initiatives, we all benefit from clean air, whether a member of the interest group or not, and we're free riders. We are benefiting from those groups and the initiatives that they are taking, even though we are not necessarily advocating for that ourselves, and that really is kind of what we see as a free rider problem. People who don't get involved but do benefit from the efforts and the actions that are taken by government to enact legislation today. This is a political cartoon, kind of again talking about the idea of lobbyists and lobbying and their roles. Here is a review of this section. There is one more section just briefly we want to talk about, and we kind of hit on it earlier, which was the idea of social movements. We mentioned a lot of the protests going on over the last few years, last summer with the Black Lives Matter movement, Occupy Wall Street a few years back in terms of tax the rich kind of thing, the Me Too movement in terms of women's issues and pay inequity there. We see social movements continue to abound and people getting much more involved, especially younger people, which is wonderful, getting more involved in these types of policy efforts to really try and bring about change. Remember, these groups could be classified as interest groups, but they're much broader because you're not going to find people of the same demographics, the same ideologies in these groups. These are much broader initiatives that are bringing people together, which is wonderful, and encouraging them to take political action, to take next steps in order to be more politically active, which is great. But again, these interest groups, these larger movements also have to maintain that momentum, and that's really hard to do for a larger group. So we can see this through protest, the public demonstrations. We've also seen this through civil disobedience, the idea of the civil rights movement and the sit-ins, calling attention to social justice issues and the need for addressing those types of things. But again, those take shape and are very actively supported in the short term. It's harder to keep that large swath of people involved in the long term, and that really is the the difference here. It's hard to keep that momentum going. A lot of times it's because of leadership and other resources, infrastructure, but also it's hard to be mad all the time. It's hard to be to be so emotionally engaged all the time. Everybody needs a break sooner or later, and then get moving again. And the other aspect is people find other interest groups that are smaller and more tailored to what they're focused on. So maybe they join the ACLU, or they join People for the American Way, or they join a group that is more focused on where they want their efforts to be placed, and so they're much more targeted with how they place that, and so that is more effective, and which means the larger group is a lot harder to keep. This is what we call Olson's theory of large groups. When we have a lot more free riders when we have a large group, because people are like, well, they'll take on that initiative, I don't need to worry about it. Well, I'll let somebody else handle that, and then nobody handles it, right? And that is really the problem with large groups, is that everybody thinks someone else is going to take on the initiative, and then therefore no one does, and that really creates major problems for the group, because it's harder to keep the momentum going when you're losing active members, and those that remain are people who aren't really getting involved. It is important to note that you should be able to compare interest groups and social movements in terms of similarities and differences, how they use their strategies, to enact policy, how they use them when it comes to elected officials, both inside and outside of Capitol Hill. So how they use them internally for elected officials, how they use them externally for candidates and campaigns in order to get out the vote. So that's a very important aspect of what you will see and you should know about interest groups in terms of applying it to the AP exam. All right, here are the key concepts and terms from the chapters in this unit. And that wraps up our overview on interest groups for this chapter. We have one more chapter, ladies and gentlemen. We will be back with the overview on the media, our final chapter in Unit 5 and our final chapter in AP Gov. I hope you found this helpful. We'll see you soon.